Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 essential, and I mean essential, piano sonatas for beginners. Now, what is a piano sonata? Well, it is a piece of music for solo piano, which is the piano solo equivalent of a symphony, basically, or a concerto. In other words, a big work, often in several sections or movements. They can be quite long and impressive, or they can be quite pithy and concise. The piano sonata has a very illustrious history, really in a more generalized sense as the keyboard sonata, because before the piano was invented, you played them on a harpsichord or a clavichord or something oared, some other sort of keyboard object. But anything that was written for the keyboard you can play on a piano, or really on one of those earlier things, except that piano sonatas for the actual piano tend to require actual pianos, because pianos have a big range of like notes, octaves, like a lot of big keyboard, and it's a thing to get all the notes and all that stuff. But the piano sonata was a very, very popular medium up until really the 20th century. And then they sort of started to trickle away. And I think the reason is similar to what happened with violin concertos. Violin concertos used to be thick and furious because virtuoso violinists wrote them for themselves. And so they just churned them out. Every time they did a concert, they needed a new concerto, and so they'd write one for themselves. And so violin virtuosi wrote tons of really lousy concertos. Pianists also wrote music for themselves. They wrote concertos and they wrote sonatas, piano sonatas. Violinists wrote violin sonatas. So there were a lot of piano sonatas when there were a lot of virtuoso pianists. But as time wore on, it seems that there were fewer piano virtuosos playing only their own music, number one. And number two, the concept of the sonata became a bigger deal. It was not a light piece of drawing room entertainment. When the piano recital started to happen, which was invented by Liszt, by the way. He was the guy who invented the piano recital. That is, just a pianist giving a concert. Before that, the keyboard guy was there to accompany the singer or the violinist or the cellist, and the keyboard guy would do a solo. I mean, he would get his moment of glory, but concerts were a mixed bag of entertainment. Liszt invented the recital where the focus was entirely on him. And for those recitals, sonatas had to become somewhat more important, and composers started to write less of them. And so instead of a giant, bunch of sonatas, you find composers who just write one or two or three, but they're big, serious works. They're major, major works. They're not light and relaxed works. And we will see this process as we go through our list. So we are going to go through the list starting really with the first great piano sonata guy. And it's not who you might expect. It's C.P.E. Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the son of Johann Sebastian Bach. And C.P.E. lived in the latter half of the 18th century. I mean, he started writing music in like the 1730s, and he died around the 1780s. He had a very productive career, and he wrote hundreds of sonatas. Most of them are in three movements, going fast, slow, fast. And those movements are all in binary form. That is, they have two halves, both of which are repeated. I mean, that was sort of the structure that C.P.E. Bach adopted. And these pieces are marvelous. Yes, there are hundreds, but I have chosen just one. Just one, which you can probably find rather easily on YouTube. And it's not long. It's about 10 minutes long. It's his Sonata in G minor, Wotken 65/17. Now, C.P.E. Bach has Wotken numbers, just like Mozart has Kerschel numbers from the guy who put his catalog together. Wotken numbers are WQ. And WQ 65 is a big group of like 50 miscellaneous sonatas that were never published. And this one is number 17 in that list of 50, which equals Wotken 65. So it's Wotken 65, number 17. Now, there is a whole other catalog of C.P.E. Bach which has H numbers. And if you're going by H numbers, this is H number 47, because this is not big clumps of sonatas. This is sort of individual ones, just listed individually, which may be easier. But the point is, it's the sonata in G minor, either WQ 65/17, and I've written it right down below so you can see it and see what it looks like, or H47. Doesn't matter which one you pick, you'll get the same piece of music. C.P.E. Bach was known for his extremely eruptive, emotional, jagged, crazy style. It's music of incredible variety and changes in mood, very, very rapid changes of mood. It was called the Empfindsamstil, or the expressive or emotional style. And the idea was just the opposite of what it was in C.P.E. Bach's dad's day. In the J.S. Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach's day, music and Baroque music was governed by the doctrine of the single affect. That meant that a piece of music or a movement or a big section should only display one emotion expressively. And then when that was done, you moved on to the other one. Well, C.P. Bach is just the opposite. He tossed that down the toilet and wrote absolutely wildly expressive music with a huge range. And this particular sonata, you will think, was written about 200 years later. It sounds like jazz. It's very, very interesting. And I can't even describe it. I can only say that if you really want to have a good time and to get your sonata juices flowing for you guys at the beginning, just listen to it. It's so much fun. It's an extraordinary piece of music. It sounds like a free improvisation by a early classical or late Baroque jazz musician. That's what it sounds like. I am not kidding. So let's move from that to high classicism. That is where everything is poise and symmetry and beautiful vocal melodies. And do Mozart. Now, Mozart actually didn't write that many piano sonatas. There are 18 of them. The canonical number is 18. And they're not among his best piano works. Some of them are. A handful of them are. But some of them were written for beginners like us, or for his pupils, students and things like that. And he didn't spend as much time on them as he did, for example, his piano concertos or his chamber music with piano in it, like the piano quartets or piano trios and things like that. However, I have chosen the most famous of all the Mozart sonatas. And some would say, no, you should pick another one because it's deeper and more complex. And yes, that's true. But this is the Sonata in C major, Koelschel 545. Yeah, that's it. 545. It's the one that goes da 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 ba da da, ya da 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 ba da da da. Now, Mozart did write bigger and greater piano sonatas than this one, but I chose this one because of its simplicity, its elegance. It's lovely. It's absolutely lovely. Mozart said he wrote it for beginners. He called it the Sonata Facile, the easy sonata for beginners. And there's no reason to crap on it just because it's easy and because we know the tunes. The real reason I want you to listen to it isn't just because you know the tune, the opening, or you probably know the tune. I don't want to second guess anybody here. If you don't know it, it's not a crime. You're going to know it very shortly. But because nobody listens to the other two movements. It has 3 movements. And I think part of the point of these listening exercises, especially when we deal with familiar music, is that you have to listen to the whole work. You don't just listen to the little tiny bit that you may have heard somewhere else. So listen to the whole sonata. Again, it's not terribly long, but it has 3 delicious movements and 2 that you probably don't know. And that's the reason to give it a shot and get to know works as wholes. It's important. It's important when you're getting into classical music. It really is, to understand that a single work has multiple sections and those sections belong together. They create a unity somehow. And you may not be conscious of how, and they may not share themes, and there may be all kinds of things that reasons why it's a unified whole that don't strike you initially. But the more you get to know the music, the more you understand that the whole point of music in these large forms is to express a variety of moods through different sections or pieces of different length. And this is a typical example in a very, very, very beautiful, simple, elegant way composed by a genius. So, like, what's wrong with that, huh? I ask you. After Mozart, Haydn. Now, it's very, very little known that Haydn wrote lots of sonatas. I mean, there are 62 of them, or 52, depending on whose numbering you use. Because once again, we have two numberings. There is the Hoboken, H-O-B, numbering, and there is the Landon, the L numbering. The Landon numbering has 10 more than the Hoboken numbering. Now, some of the Haydn sonatas are actually lost. And there was, a big controversy a few years back when they discovered purportedly some Haydn sonatas, which Landon, actually the husband of this particular Landon, this is Christa Landon, but the great Haydn scholar H.C. Robbins Landon authenticated, and they turned out to be fake. It was very embarrassing. But Haydn sonatas are, on the whole, rather more interesting than Mozart's. And I'm just saying that as I'm throwing it out there. I mean, Mozart's are, of course, some of them are just incredibly great, as I pointed out. But there are a lot of really good Haydn sonatas because they were written more for talented amateurs rather than as teaching pieces. Haydn didn't really teach much of anybody. He composed for other artists. And in those days, piano sonatas were really written to be played at home. They were not concert works, but they were made to be played at home by lady pianists as often as not. And some of these women who were forbidden for social reasons from performing in public were exceptionally talented pianists, real virtuosi. And Haydn wrote some of his sonatas for these people. Now, number 62 or 52 is in E flat major. It's the last sonata Haydn wrote, and it is one of the very first concert sonatas. It was written to be performed publicly in a public concert, and it's a big sonata written not for the harpsichord, but for a real piano with pedals and all of the doodads that the modern piano has. And it's a brilliant work. It's funny. It's Haydn. It's funny, and it's colorful, and it's got great tunes and sudden reverses and all kinds of amazing things in it. It's a fabulous, fabulous work. One that you really ought to know because it's just a joy from first note to last. So after Haydn, we come to Beethoven, who was Haydn's student, sort of. I mean, Haydn did teach him. They didn't get along very well. Now, Beethoven was the guy who really put the piano sonata on the map. He wrote 32 of them. And his 32 piano sonatas are the Bible of pianists everywhere. And so for that reason, I chose 2 Beethoven sonatas. You have to, I couldn't just go with one. It's not possible. An early one and a middle one. And the early one is the Pathétique sonata, his sonata number 8 in C minor. I actually played that sonata. Well, sort of, kind of. I did. I played it, not very well. Oh, what a beautiful piece it is. And you may know that as well. It's very, very popular. And the slow movement is so beautiful. It's that dum bum ba ya da 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 da. You recognize that tune? Well, maybe not the way I sang it. It's a work of stunning genius, and it's early Beethoven, and it's the kind of thing that stunned the universe, because Beethoven was a fire-breathing virtuoso, the likes of which the musical world had never seen, and he wrote these pieces for himself, and he was famous for playing them so hard that he broke the strings on the piano. And this is one of those pieces that you could break a couple strings. You really could. It's really powerful and emotional and expressive. Oh, it's wonderful. So after that, we'll do a middle sonata. It's his sonata number, 21? Yeah, in C20, 21. The Waldstein sonata, which is named after some aristocratic patron that, Beethoven dedicated it to. This is a big sonata. It is a piece that shows you what was happening as the sonata started to grow in importance and musical sophistication. It is another work of just appalling genius. You listen to it and you just go, Oh God, I wish I could do something like that. You know, it's so, so, so powerful and impressive. And we're getting to real virtuoso piano stuff with works like this. So these two sonatas, the Pathétique and the Waldstein, really, sort of will give you a sense of what to encounter, what you'll encounter in listening to the Beethoven sonatas. Of course, there are many others that have nicknames that people like. There's the Moonlight Sonata, let's not forget. There's the Farewell Sonata. There's the Pastoral Sonata. There's all kinds of sonatas, and some of them don't have names, and they're just as good. So if you want to go off on your own after hearing these two sonatas, there's 30 more of them for you to play with, and they span Beethoven's whole career, from his very, very earliest days to his very, very latest works. So they give the most complete impression of his progress as a composer as well. And believe you me, from where he started to where he wound up is one amazing ride. It's an incredible journey, and you could spend a lifetime really just listening to the Beethoven sonatas, because they are an inexhaustible treasure of great music. And I will leave it at that and move on to Chopin. Chopin's Second Sonata in B flat minor. This is the Funeral March Sonata. You know that funeral march. Dum bum ba bum da 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 dum ba bum. Right? Did you know that Chopin wrote that? Did you know that it was originally a piano sonata, the slow movement? Actually, Chopin wrote that movement first, and then he wrote the whole rest of the sonata around that movement. It's such a focal point in the work as a whole. But the whole sonata is a big work. It has 4 movements, just like a symphony. And, nobody knows the other 3. But you will. And, it's marvelous. The first one is wonderfully neurotic. It has this stern opening, and then this wonderful tune. Ba-dum, ba-da-da, da-da, da-da-da, da-da, da-da-da, da-da, da-da-da, da-da, da-da-da, da-da, da-da-da. It palpitates. And then there's a scherzo, or joke, or minuet, a dance movement, very stern in this case. And then the big, long funeral march. And then the coolest finale written, like in the entire first half of the 19th century, the 19th century, or in about the 1830s by now, or thereabouts. And it's almost without tonality. It's been described as a wind blowing over the graves. It's the logical successor to that funeral march, because what could you do after that funeral march? It is spooky beyond belief, and only about 1.5 minutes long. It's an extraordinary piece, really, really cool and really creepy. And it really sort of, it makes the piano sonata, again, one of the most powerful kinds of music that you can hear. It's a landmark in the history of the sonata because of the expressive intensity of the music, and also because of the significance of the music. The piano sonata as a vehicle for some of the composer's greatest and most profound thoughts. And so the Chopin Piano Sonata No. 2 is definitely one of those works. And after Chopin, we're going to do his buddy. Actually, I have 3 virtuoso piano sonatas now by 3 guys who knew each other. So after Chopin comes Alkan, his real name was something like Charles Valentin Morang or something like that, but he went by the name Alkan, A-L-K-A-N, and we have talked about him before in our theme and variations talk, because he wrote Aesop's Feast. But he also wrote a monstrous piano sonata, about 45, 50 minutes long, fascinating work called The 4 Ages, Les Quatre Âges, The 4 Ages of Mankind. And this is one of the most curious and fascinating pieces written in the entire 19th century. Trust me. And one of the great virtuoso challenges. It's very hard to pull off because the sequence of movements is extremely unusual. It begins with the scherzo, and the scherzo is a man in his 20s, and it is just as lively. It's like he's like a puppy. It's just jumping all over the place, and it goes as fast as you can humanly play it. Next comes a big big movement in what we call sonata form, that is with first movement form, with two big subjects and a development section and a big recapitulation of those two big subjects and a coda, and it's called quasi-Faust. As if, Faust, the guy Faust, who was always, made the deal with the devil and was always striving. And the devil appears in here. There's a part of it represents the devil, and Faust and the devil go at it. And it's a tone poem. It's an extraordinary piece. Also appallingly difficult to play, but a little slower than the first movement. The third movement is the guy in his 40s or so at this point, and it's domestic tranquility. He's home with his kids. It's a beautiful, serene, singing, slowish movement. It's not totally slow, but it's just beautiful and relaxed. And after all the striving and defeating the devil and stuff, the guy gets to relax at home with the kids and the wife and watch television and put his feet up, and it's really nice. But the last movement is even slower, so it's successively slowing down. It's called Prometheus Chained, and it's a funeral march, similar to the Chopin funeral march. So you can get a sense of that topic, that topos, the funeral march idea in piano music by listening to this last movement, Prometheus Chained, and that's the end. It ends in total darkness, which is what happened when you were 50 in those days, supposedly. What an extraordinary piece. Not an easy piece, but I personally feel that if the music is great, that's all you need. Some people feel that, well, they're beginners, they have to take it easy, they have to do just listen to the Mozart and don't listen to the rest of them. But my feeling is just the opposite. You never know what's going to hit you. And the only way you're going to find out what's going to hit you, what's going to appeal to you, what kind of music really floats your boat, is if you listen to all different kinds of music. And if you do that, then you'll find yourself, I think, in a very, very good situation to explore on your own and trust your own instincts and your own feelings. And this is one of those pieces that's just a great way to get to know that. So after Alkan, we have Liszt. Yeah, Liszt of the Hungarian Rhapsodies. Well, this is not that. This is the Liszt Piano Sonata, and Liszt wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of piano works, tons and tons, but only one sonata. And it's a 30-minute behemoth in one single movement. It's 30 minutes in a single movement that incorporates several sections, like a regular 4-movement sonata. There's a slow movement, there's a scherzo, there's a finale. This has a big fugue in it, a big contrapuntal fandango, all based on the opening tunes. And the whole thing is based on transformations of just a couple ideas that you hear right at the beginning, and that are as clear as day and as easy to follow as anything you've ever heard in your life. It's another piece that is one of the great virtuoso vehicles. All the major pianists in the universe want to do it. Not all of them can do it because it's extraordinarily difficult, but it's one of the great 19th century piano sonatas. And it's an indication of how important the sonata started to become, that Liszt only wrote that one. It was a tremendous effort, and it's one of his great masterpieces. Even people who don't normally like Liszt, and you may hear lots of people say that Liszt is kind of trashy, it's kind of a joke in the classical music biz, because he was kind of trashy, but he was also a genius. And so even the people who generally denigrate Liszt think that the sonatas usually say that the sonata is just a masterpiece. It's an amazing piece of music. And it's something that requires a great deal of attention. Just, if you have half an hour, just set it aside and drop the needle and let it roll over you. And then see how you feel about it. That's the name of the game. So after Liszt, we're going to move forward even more into the 20th century with two fabulous Russians. Number one is Scriabin. Now, Scriabin was he was a theosophist, if you know what that was. It was one of these sort of religious cult things, and we don't need to go into the details. And he thought that he saw music in various colors and thought that he was headed towards the, divine reincarnation of the spiritual universe through his mystical harmonies. And I mean, he was out of his mind. Yeah, he was just nuts. And he wrote a bunch of piano sonatas that got progressively stranger as he got older and more into this, mystical stuff. He wrote one called the White Mass and one called the Black Mass. And he wrote all kinds. He wrote the poem of Ecstasy, the great orchestral work. I have chosen his Sonata No. 5 because I just love this sonata. It is a beautiful work in a single movement, 10 minutes long or so. That's the whole work. You don't have to worry about anything like form. It does have some. No one is quite sure what, but it has some. And it does have some repetition in it, but it's just one of these pieces that it's just a thing. He called it sonata because he had nothing else to call it. There was no other name that would do it justice, and there was no other way to describe it. And you just play it, and it exists. It's just a brilliant and wonderful work, a delightful piece of piano music, and it's as short and compact as the Liszt is sort of long and expansive. And I think you'll really have a good time with it. It's just, it's delightful. And then if you like it, you've got like his other 9 or however many there are sonatas. And like I said, they go from a sort of a Chopin type style. If you like Chopin, then you can hear early Scriabin, to complete insanity. Whoa. And it's a fun sort of path to follow, to chart his progress from one sonata to the next. And so 5 is right in the middle, and it's glorious. However, we have to wrap it up, and I'm wrapping it up with a sonata by really the great 20th century sonata composer of the first half of the 20th century anyway, and that was Prokofiev, who was a tremendous virtuoso pianist, and he wrote a whole passel of sonatas. Not many people were writing lots of sonatas in quantity, but he wrote, I don't know how many did he write, 11 or so, I mean nearly a dozen, and they are wonderful works. And he wrote a series of 3 during World War II. They're known as the War Sonatas, and those were numbers 6, 7, and 8. And I've chosen number 7. Number 7 is, by general consensus, the greatest of the 3 wartime sonatas, or at least it's the most popular. And it is a very, very powerful piece of music. I mean, really, really strong and somewhat naughty and dissonant and harmonically acerbic, and so not easy listening, but it's really intense, wonderfully intense music with a dazzling finale, extraordinary finale, really worth getting to know. And it will probably take a couple of listenings for you to get into it completely, but it's well worth doing, I assure you, because first of all, Prokofiev writes great tunes. Even when they're dissonantly harmonized, he writes really memorable ideas. Call them ideas. Sometimes they're melodies, singable melodies like Peter and the Wolf. Sometimes they're just more idea type things, but they're really distinctive. They have abundant character, and the piano writing is just tremendously exciting and strong. And I think you'll really enjoy it. So Prokofiev's Sonata No. 7 is the last of our 10 essential sonatas for beginners. Some of them are easy, some of them are less so. All of them are worth your time and attention. All of them are worth listening to. None of them have anything tricky about them if you're willing to put the time in to get to know them. So I hope you do that. Keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.